Sometimes the truest companions find us when we've given up on the world. For 30 years, Eli Thatcher has lived alone in Montana's wilderness, carrying wounds that time couldn't heal. When a bloodied hound stumbles into his camp, limping and desperate, Eli sees something familiar in those faithful eyes, the look of a survivor who refuses to quit. The dog leads him through the forest to a crashed plane hidden in the trees. It looks old, maybe from the Cold War, but fresh footprints circle the wreckage. Inside, Eli finds classified documents and something that makes his blood run cold. This plane was carrying secrets that powerful people still want buried. Now Eli must face the ghosts of his military past to protect what matters most. What deadly truth was worth hiding for decades, and who's still willing to kill for it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like an old man's memories, reluctant to let go of the night. Eli Thatcher stood on the porch of his cabin, a weathered structure that had withstood 30 Montana winters, much like the man himself. At 65, his hands bore the calluses of decades spent working with rope, axe, and rifle. His beard, more silver than brown now, caught the first rays of sunlight filtering through the towering pines. The coffee in his tin cup had gone cold, but Eli didn't notice. His attention was fixed on the forest edge, where something had been moving in the pre-dawn darkness. Not the usual deer or elk. This was different, deliberate, struggling. The sound came again, a low whimper that cut through the mountain silence like a blade through canvas. Eli set his cup on the porch rail and stepped into the clearing, his boots crunching softly on the frost-covered grass. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as he listened, head tilted toward the sound. 30 years ago, Sergeant First Class Eli Thatcher would have already had his weapon drawn, would have been calculating angles and escape routes. But that man had died in the mountains of Afghanistan, buried under an avalanche of guilt and classified reports. The man who emerged from those peaks had sought only solitude, trading his uniform for flannel and his squad for the company of wind through pine needles. The whimpering grew closer, accompanied now by the sound of something dragging through the underbrush. Eli's hand moved instinctively to the Colt 45 holstered at his hip. Some habits never died, no matter how deep you buried them. But when the source of the sound finally emerged from the tree line, his hand fell away from the weapon. It was a dog, a blue-tick coonhound by the look of it, though its normally pristine coat was matted with blood and mud. The animal limped forward on 3 legs, the fourth held gingerly off the ground. Its ribs showed through patches where fur had been torn away, and one ear hung at an odd angle, as if it had been caught in something sharp and unforgiving. But it was the dog's eyes that stopped Eli cold. They held an intelligence, a purpose that he recognized from his own reflection in darker times. This wasn't a lost pet, wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. This was a creature on a mission, driven by something beyond mere survival instinct. The hound stopped at the edge of Eli's camp, swaying slightly on its 3 good legs. Its tongue lolled out, pink and dry, and Eli could see the exhaustion in every line of its body. Yet the dog's gaze never wavered from his face, as if it were trying to communicate something vital, something urgent. "Easy there, boy," Eli said, his voice rusty from disuse. He spoke more to animals than humans these days. They made better company and asked fewer questions about a man's past. "Let's see what's got you all torn up." He approached slowly, hands visible and non-threatening. The military had taught him to read situations, to assess threats and opportunities with equal measure. This dog was no threat, but the story written in its wounds suggested that something dangerous lurked in these mountains, something that didn't belong in his carefully constructed world of solitude. The hound allowed Eli to examine its injuries, though it whined softly when he probed the damaged leg. Not broken, he determined, but badly sprained. The cuts were numerous, but shallow, consistent with running through dense brush at high speed. The torn ear looked like it had been caught on barbed wire, Though Eli knew of no fencing in this remote area, "You've come a long way, haven't you?" he murmured, running his hands through the dog's coat, checking for other injuries. "Question is, from where? And why?" As if in response, the hound struggled to its feet and took several halting steps back toward the forest. It stopped, looked over its shoulder at Eli, and whined again, a sound that seemed to carry both plea and command. Eli had spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize the behavior. The dog wanted him to follow. In his younger days, he might have dismissed such anthropomorphism as foolish sentiment, but 30 years of solitude had taught him to listen to the subtler communications of the natural world. Animals possessed an honesty that humans had long since abandoned, and this particular animal was trying very hard to tell him something important. The smart thing would be to tend to the dog's wounds, give it food and water, and send it on its way. Eli had come to these mountains to escape complications, to live out his remaining years in peace, with nothing more demanding than chopping wood and tending his small garden. Following a wounded animal into unknown territory was exactly the kind of decision that led to trouble. But as he looked into those intelligent brown eyes, Eli saw something that resonated in his chest, a recognition that passed between two souls who had seen too much and lost too much to ignore a call for help when it finally came. "All right," he said quietly, the decision settling in his bones like the ache of an old injury. "But we do this smart." He returned to the cabin and gathered his gear with the methodical precision of a man who had once lived by such preparations. The pack he pulled from the closet was military surplus, worn but well maintained. Into it went water, dried rations, first aid supplies, and a coil of rope. His rifle, a lever-action Winchester that had belonged to his grandfather, went into its scabbard on his back. The dog watched these preparations with what seemed like approval, its tail giving the barest hint of a wag. When Eli emerged from the cabin fully equipped, the hound stood and began limping toward the forest, moving with renewed purpose despite its injuries. The trail, such as it was, led north into the heart of the Glacier Peak wilderness. Eli had explored much of this territory over the years, but the dog seemed to know paths he had never seen, weaving through deadfall and around granite outcroppings with the confidence of familiarity. Despite its injuries, the animal maintained a steady pace, pausing only occasionally to ensure that Eli was still following. The forest here was old growth, towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks that had witnessed centuries of seasons. Their canopy filtered the morning light into a green-gold cathedral of shadow and silence. Eli's boots found purchase on the thick carpet of needles, his breath coming easier despite the altitude as his body remembered the rhythm of pursuit. As they climbed higher, the trees began to change. The massive old growth gave way to younger stands, areas where forest fires had cleared the land decades ago, and nature had begun its patient work of renewal. It was in one of these clearings that the dog finally stopped, sitting heavily on its haunches and letting out a long, mournful howl that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Eli emerged from the tree line and felt his breath catch in his throat. Below them, in a narrow valley carved by some long-ago glacier, lay the twisted wreckage of an aircraft. But this was no modern plane that had strayed off course from the nearby air corridors. The shape was wrong, the design decades out of date. Even from this distance, Eli could see the angular lines and riveted construction that spoke of another era. Another time when such machines had carried different kinds of cargo across hostile skies. The hound whined again, a sound now filled with urgency, and began picking its way down the steep slope toward the crash site. Eli followed, his mind racing with questions and possibilities, none of them good. In his years of military service, he had learned that when something looked wrong, felt wrong, and appeared in places where it shouldn't be, it usually meant that someone's carefully laid plans had gone sideways, and that innocent people were likely to pay the price. As they descended toward the wreckage, Eli noticed details that made his unease deepen. The trees around the crash site had been damaged, but not in the random pattern of an aircraft careening out of control. The damage was too precise, too localized, as if the plane had been brought down deliberately rather than accidentally. And there were tracks, tire tracks pressed into the soft earth around the wreckage, too fresh to have been made when the plane originally crashed. Someone had been here recently. Someone with vehicles and equipment and reasons to visit a crash site that, by all appearances, should have been forgotten decades ago. The dog reached the wreckage first, moving with surprising agility despite its injuries. It circled the twisted metal fuselage once, nose to the ground, then sat beside what had once been the aircraft's cargo door and howled again, a sound that seemed to carry both grief and warning in its mournful tones. Eli approached the crash site with the caution of a man who had learned to expect the worst from unexpected discoveries. The plane was a twin-engine transport, probably Soviet-built from the look of the construction, though any identifying markings had been stripped away or weathered beyond recognition. The fuselage had split open along one side, spilling its contents across the forest floor in a scatter of metal, debris and rotting fabric, but it was what lay among the debris that made Eli's blood run cold and brought memories flooding back from corners of his mind where he had tried to bury them forever. Among the scattered debris, half buried beneath decades of pine needles and mountain weather, lay artifacts that should not have existed in any crashed aircraft. Eli knelt beside the torn fuselage, his hands trembling slightly as he brushed away the forest debris from a metal case that bore the unmistakable stenciling of the United States Army. The case was olive drab, reinforced with steel corners and secured with a lock that had long since corroded away. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating plastic sheeting, were documents that made Eli's stomach drop. Classification stamps, code words, and operational briefings that belonged to a world he thought he had left behind forever. Operation Blackwater, he whispered, reading the header on one of the documents. The words hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories of briefings in secured rooms, of missions that officially never happened, of decisions that haunted men's sleep decades later. The hound whined softly beside him, as if sensing the change in Eli's demeanor. The dog had positioned itself between Eli and the forest, ears pricked forward, watching the tree line with an alertness that suggested danger might still lurk in these mountains. Eli's hands moved through the documents with growing unease. Maps of Soviet installations, personnel files with faces he recognized from his own classified past, and technical specifications for weapon systems that the public had never known existed. But it was the date stamps that made his blood run cold, not from the 1960s or 70s, as the aircraft's vintage would suggest, but from just 3 months ago. These were not artifacts from some long-forgotten Cold War operation. They were fresh intelligence, recently printed, recently classified. Someone had been using this crash site as a dead drop, a place to exchange information that governments preferred to keep buried. As Eli sifted through more of the contents, a photograph slipped from between the documents and fluttered to the ground. He picked it up with fingers that had begun to shake. The image showed a group of soldiers in desert camouflage, young faces squinting against Middle Eastern sun. In the center of the group, wearing sergeant's stripes and a confident smile, stood a younger version of Eli Thatcher. But it was the man standing beside him that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. Colonel Marcus Webb, his commanding officer during the darkest chapters of his military career. A man who should have been dead for 15 years, killed in an ambush in Afghanistan that Eli had witnessed firsthand. Yet here was Webb, photographed 3 months ago according to the date stamp on the back, looking barely older than he had on the day he supposedly died. Standing beside him were other faces from Eli's past, soldiers who had been declared killed in action, intelligence operatives who had been listed as missing and presumed dead. The implications crashed over Eli like an avalanche. If Webb was alive, if the others were alive, then everything he believed about that final mission in Afghanistan had been a lie. The ambush that had killed half his unit, the classified operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. The guilt he had carried for 3 decades, all of it built on deception. The hound suddenly stiffened, a low growl rumbling in its throat. Eli looked up from the photograph to see the dog staring intently at the forest edge, its hackles raised despite its injuries. In the distance, barely audible above the mountain wind, came the sound of engines, multiple vehicles moving through the wilderness with the steady determination of men on a mission. Eli's military training kicked in with frightening clarity. He stuffed the documents and photograph into his pack, his movements quick and efficient despite the emotional shock. The crash site was no longer just a mystery. It was a trap that was about to be sprung, and he and the dog were standing in the middle of it. The engine sounds grew closer, accompanied now by the crackle of radio transmissions. Professional voices coordinating approach vectors and establishing perimeters. These weren't park rangers or search and rescue personnel. This was a military operation, conducted with the precision of soldiers who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Time to go, boy," Eli murmured to the hound, slinging his pack across his shoulders. The dog seemed to understand, struggling to its feet and moving toward a game trail that led up the opposite slope. Despite its injuries, the animal moved with purpose, as if it had planned this escape route long before Eli arrived. They climbed quickly, using the natural cover of deadfall and rocky outcroppings to mask their movement. Behind them, the sound of vehicles grew louder, punctuated by the slam of doors and shouted commands. Eli risked a glance back as they reached the crest of the ridge and saw black SUVs surrounding the crash site, men in tactical gear deploying with military precision. But these weren't regular army troops. Their equipment was too advanced, their coordination too smooth, their presence in this remote location too convenient. Private military contractors, Eli realized, or worse, elements of the intelligence community operating outside official channels. As they moved through the forest, putting distance between themselves and the crash site, Eli's mind raced through the implications of what he had discovered. The documents, the photograph, the presence of armed operatives, it all pointed to a conspiracy that stretched back decades, one that had cost lives and destroyed careers in the name of secrets that someone was still desperate to protect. The hound led them along paths that seemed to exist only in its memory, winding through the mountains with an uncanny knowledge of the terrain. As the afternoon wore on, Eli began to suspect that this animal was no ordinary stray. Its knowledge of the area, its purposeful behavior, its apparent understanding of danger, everything suggested a connection to the crash site and the secrets it contained. As evening approached, they stopped beside a small mountain lake, its surface mirror-smooth in the still air. The hound lapped gratefully at the water, while Eli examined the documents more carefully in the fading light. Names, dates, and operational codes that painted a picture of betrayal and deception spanning decades. According to the files, Operation Blackwater had never ended. Instead, it had evolved, becoming a shadow network of former military personnel and intelligence operatives who traded in secrets and influenced events from behind the scenes. Men who had been officially declared dead continued to work in the shadows, their supposed deaths providing the perfect cover for operations that officially never existed. And at the center of it all was Marcus Webb, the man Eli had trusted with his life, the officer who had led them into that final disastrous mission in Afghanistan, the man whose death Eli had grieved for 15 years, whose memory had haunted every quiet moment since. But Webb wasn't dead. He was very much alive, and based on the intelligence reports, he was still recruiting former soldiers into his shadow organization. Men with specific skills, men with reasons to disappear from their old lives, men who had been broken by their service and left with nothing to lose, men like Eli Thatcher. The photograph wasn't just evidence of Webb's survival, it was an invitation, a message delivered through the most elaborate means possible, designed to draw Eli out of his self-imposed exile and back into a world he had tried desperately to leave behind. The hound whined softly. pressing against Eli's leg as if sensing his distress. He looked down at the animal and saw intelligence in those brown eyes, a depth of understanding that went beyond simple animal instinct. This dog wasn't just a messenger, it was a guardian, sent to guide him safely to this discovery and away from the dangers that followed. As darkness settled over the mountains, Eli made a decision that would change everything. He could destroy the documents, bury the photograph, and pretend that none of this had happened. He could return to his cabin and continue his exile, living out his remaining years in willful ignorance of the truth, or he could follow the trail that Webb had laid for him, confront the ghosts of his past, and finally learn the truth about the mission that had destroyed his faith in everything he had once believed. The hound looked up at him expectantly, as if waiting for his decision. In its eyes, Eli saw the same question that had haunted him for 30 years. What price was he willing to pay for the truth? And for the first time in decades, Eli Thatcher knew the answer. The decision to pursue the truth came with immediate consequences. As dawn broke over the mountain lake, Eli discovered that their pursuers had not given up the hunt. Smoke signals rose from multiple points in the valley below, not actual smoke, but the telltale exhaust plumes of vehicles moving through the forest, coordinating a systematic search pattern. The hound, which Eli had begun calling Scout in his mind, seemed to sense the renewed danger. The dog's ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds that Eli's aging hearing couldn't detect. Despite its injuries, Scout moved with renewed urgency, leading them higher into the mountains, along paths that seemed to exist only in the animal's memory. "You know these mountains better than I do," Eli murmured, as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of loose shale. "Question is how, and who taught you the way?" The answer came partially as they crested a ridge overlooking a hidden valley. Below them, nestled among a grove of ancient pines, stood the ruins of what had once been a fire lookout tower. The structure was decades old, built in an era when Forest Service personnel lived in isolation for months at a time, watching for the first signs of wildfire. But this tower showed signs of recent habitation. Solar panels had been rigged to provide power, and a sophisticated radio antenna extended from the platform. Scout bounded down the slope with surprising energy, his tail wagging for the first time since Eli had found him. At the base of the tower, Eli discovered the dog's story. A lean-to shelter had been constructed from salvage materials, and inside, on a makeshift bed of pine boughs and military surplus sleeping bags, lay the body of an elderly man. The man had been dead for several days, Eli determined, but the peaceful expression on his weathered face suggested natural causes rather than violence. Beside the body lay a journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting that told a story of exile and vigilance. Thomas Kellerman, Master Sergeant, United States Army, retired, Eli read from the journal's first page. "If you're reading this, then Scout has done his job and led the right person to the truth." The entries that followed painted a picture of a man much like Eli himself, a soldier broken by service, seeking peace in the wilderness but unable to escape the shadows of his past. Kellerman had discovered the crash site years ago and had gradually pieced together the truth about Operation Blackwater and the network of supposedly dead operatives who continued to manipulate events from the shadows. "Webb recruited me in Afghanistan," one entry read. "Said my death in that ambush would free me from a government that had betrayed its own soldiers. Took me years to realize I was just trading one kind of prison for another." Kellerman had spent the last decade of his life documenting Webb's organization, gathering evidence of their activities and waiting for someone with the skills and motivation to expose the truth. The crash site had been their communication hub, a place where intelligence was exchanged and operations coordinated. But Kellerman had turned it into a trap, documenting every visit, every exchange, every piece of evidence that passed through. "Scout knows the mountain better than any GPS," another entry explained. "Trained him myself to find help if something happened to me." If you're reading this, then my heart finally gave out, and the dog has brought you to finish what I started." Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Kellerman's death hadn't been natural, it had been carefully timed. The intelligence documents at the crash site, the photograph of Webb, the approaching search teams. It was all part of an elaborate recruitment operation designed to draw Eli out of hiding. Webb knew exactly where Eli lived, knew about his self-imposed exile, knew that the right stimulus would force him to act. The crash site, the documents, even Scout himself, everything had been carefully orchestrated to manipulate Eli into making this choice. But understanding the manipulation didn't diminish the reality of what Kellerman had discovered. The evidence was overwhelming. Webb's organization had been responsible for the ambush in Afghanistan that had supposedly killed them all. They had faked their own deaths to escape accountability, then continued their operations outside official oversight. Accountable to no one. "The bastard played me," Eli said aloud, and Scout whined in response, pressing against his leg with surprising warmth. But that doesn't make the evidence any less real. Kellerman's journal contained detailed maps of the organization's activities, financial records showing payments to former military personnel, and most damning of all, operational reports describing missions that had resulted in civilian casualties across multiple theaters of operation. These weren't patriots operating in the shadows to protect their country. They were mercenaries, using their official deaths as cover for activities that would have landed them in federal prison if conducted under their real identities. As Eli absorbed the full scope of Kellerman's evidence, Scout suddenly tensed, his ears pricked toward the valley below. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, moved figures in tactical gear, ascending the mountain with the methodical precision of a military sweep. They had been found. Eli quickly gathered Kellerman's most important documents, stuffing them into his pack alongside the materials from the crash site. The radio equipment in the tower offered possibilities, but using it would only reveal their location to anyone monitoring the frequencies. "Time to go, Scout," he said, shouldering his pack. The dog was already moving, leading him away from the tower toward a trail that switchbacked up the mountainside. As they climbed, Eli heard the distant sound of helicopters. The search was expanding, becoming more sophisticated. Webb's people weren't just tracking them, they were herding them, using superior numbers and technology to force Eli towards some predetermined destination. The question was whether that destination represented capture or something more sinister. The trail Scout chose led them through increasingly difficult terrain, across rock faces where a single misstep would mean a fatal fall. But the dog moved with confidence, as if this route had been planned and practiced. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew more distant, suggesting that their hunters were being forced to take easier but longer routes. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they reached a high plateau where the forest thinned and granite peaks dominated the landscape. Here, Scout led Eli to another cache, this one hidden beneath a seemingly natural pile of stones. Inside the cache were supplies clearly placed by Kellerman: water, food, ammunition, and a handheld GPS unit programmed with coordinates that meant nothing to Eli, but seemed to energize Scout. The dog studied the GPS display, as if reading it, then set off across the plateau with renewed purpose. "You're not just any dog, are you?" Eli said, following the animal across the exposed granite. "Kellerman trained you for this, didn't he? Trained you to find someone like me and lead them to the truth." Scout paused in his movement and looked back at Eli, his intelligent eyes seeming to confirm the assessment. This wasn't just a loyal pet, it was a highly trained partner, as much a part of Kellerman's plan as the documented evidence or the carefully orchestrated discovery at the crash site. But as they moved across the plateau, Eli began to understand that they weren't just fleeing from Webb's people. They were moving towards something, following a plan that Kellerman had spent years developing. The coordinates in the GPS weren't random. They marked a destination where the final pieces of the puzzle waited to be discovered. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit continued, but Scout seemed unconcerned. The dog had brought Eli this far by following a plan that anticipated every move, every decision, every attempt at manipulation. Now it was time to discover what Thomas Kellerman had really died to. Protect. The coordinates led them to a place that defied both logic and geography. A natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside where the granite walls rose like cathedral pillars toward the darkening sky. But it wasn't the geological wonder that stopped Eli in his tracks. It was what human hands had built within this hidden sanctuary, a communications complex stretched across the amphitheater floor, its equipment sophisticated enough to rival anything the military had used during Eli's active service. Satellite dishes tracked across the sky with mechanical precision, while banks of computers hummed quietly in climate-controlled enclosures. Solar panels and wind generators provided power, their output feeding into systems that clearly operated around the clock. Scout bounded toward the complex with obvious familiarity, his injuries seemingly forgotten in his excitement. The dog led Eli to a reinforced bunker built into the amphitheater wall, where a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar. Inside, banks of monitors displayed information streams from around the world: financial markets, military communications, intelligence reports from agencies that officially didn't acknowledge each other's existence. At the center of the complex sat a chair that had clearly been occupied recently. The coffee in the nearby cup was still warm, and computer screens showed active monitoring sessions that had been interrupted rather than properly terminated. Someone had left this place in a hurry, but not before ensuring that their work could be continued by whoever arrived next. Eli approached the main console with growing understanding. This wasn't just a communications facility. It was a nerve center, a place where someone had been monitoring and documenting the activities of Webb's shadow network for years. Kellerman hadn't been a passive observer of Operation Blackwater's evolution. He had been actively working to expose it, gathering evidence and building a case that could bring down the entire organization. The primary monitor displayed a complex web of connections linking names, dates, and operations across multiple continents. At the center of the web was Marcus Webb, but the connections extended far beyond anything Eli had imagined. Politicians, defense contractors, intelligence officials, and foreign operatives, all connected by threads of shared operations and financial transactions that painted a picture of corruption reaching to the highest levels of government. "Jesus," Eli whispered, studying the display. "Tom, what did you stumble into?" Scout whined softly and padded to a secondary console, placing his paws on the keyboard with surprising delicacy. The screens flickered, then displayed a video file that began playing automatically. Thomas Kellerman's weathered face appeared on the monitor, recorded sometime in the past few weeks based on his appearance. "If you're watching this, then I'm dead, and Scout has successfully guided you to the truth," Kellerman's recorded voice said. "I'm sorry for the deception, Eli. Yes, I know who you are. I know about your service record, your exile, and your reasons for leaving civilization behind. More importantly, I know that you're one of the few people with both the skills and the moral courage to finish what I started." The recording continued, Kellerman's explanation filling in gaps that had puzzled Eli since finding the crash site. The entire sequence, the documents, the photograph, even Scout's arrival at his cabin, had been carefully orchestrated not by Webb, but by Kellerman himself. A dead man's final operation, designed to recruit the one person capable of exposing the truth. Webb's organization calls itself the Forgotten, Kellerman explained. Men who officially died in service, but continued to serve a different master, themselves. They trade in secrets, manipulate conflicts, and profit from the chaos they create. The Afghanistan ambush that supposedly killed your unit? Webb orchestrated it to provide cover for their disappearance. Eli sank into a nearby chair as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. The mission that had haunted him for 30 years, the guilt that had driven him into exile, the deaths of good soldiers, all of it orchestrated by the man he had trusted most. The evidence is all here, Kellerman's recording continued. Financial records, operational reports, communications intercepts, everything needed to expose them. But it requires someone with your specific knowledge to interpret and authenticate it. Someone who was there, who can testify to what really happened in Afghanistan. As the recording ended, Eli noticed movement on one of the perimeter monitors. Vehicles were approaching the amphitheater, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Webb's people had found them, despite the remote location and careful concealment, but Kellerman had anticipated this too. Another monitor showed escape routes, mapped throughout the mountain complex, each one marked with supply caches and communication points. Scout was already moving toward a concealed exit, his training taking over as the situation demanded. Eli quickly began copying files from Kellerman's computers onto portable drives, prioritizing the most damaging evidence. Financial records showing payments to government officials, operational reports detailing illegal activities, and most importantly, the complete file on the Afghanistan mission that had changed everything. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the amphitheater as the assault began in earnest. Floodlights swept across the complex, and tactical teams began rappelling from aircraft with military precision. But these weren't government forces. Their equipment was too advanced, their coordination too smooth. Private military contractors, accountable to no one but their paymasters. Scout barked once sharply, then disappeared through the concealed exit. Eli grabbed the portable drives and followed, emerging into a natural cave system that extended deep into the mountain. Behind them, the communications complex erupted in sparks and flames as Webb's people destroyed the evidence they couldn't capture. The cave system was extensive, clearly mapped and prepared by Kellerman over years of planning. Emergency supplies were cached at regular intervals, and battery-powered lights marked the route toward distant exits. Scout moved through the tunnels with confidence, his training evident in every decision, every turn, every pause, to ensure Eli was following. As they moved deeper into the mountain, Eli heard explosions echoing through the complex behind them. Webb's people were being thorough, destroying anything that might contain evidence of their activities. But they were too late. The most damaging information was already copied and moving beyond their reach. Hours later, they emerged from the cave system on the far side of the mountain, where Kellerman had positioned a final cache containing supplies for extended wilderness survival. The old soldier had planned for every contingency, even his own death, ensuring that his evidence would reach someone capable of acting on it. But as Eli examined the cached supplies, he realized that Kellerman's plan extended beyond mere exposure of Webb's organization. Hidden among the survival gear was a satellite phone, programmed with contact numbers for investigative journalists, congressional oversight committees, and international tribunals. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Scout settled beside Eli in the pre-dawn darkness, his intelligent eyes reflecting the stars. The dog had completed his mission, successfully guiding Eli to the truth and away from immediate danger. But both of them understood that the real mission was just beginning. Somewhere in the darkness below, Webb's people were regrouping, planning their next move. They had lost the complex, but they still had resources, influence, and the desperation of men with everything to lose. The hunt was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. 3 days of hiking through wilderness that seemed designed to test human endurance brought them to the edge of civilization, if the scattered collection of buildings ahead could be called that. Timber Falls had been a logging town once, before the forests were depleted and the mill closed down. Now it survived on hunting guides, seasonal tourists, and the kind of people who preferred their neighbors distant and their questions unasked. Scout had led them here with purpose, following game trails and abandoned logging roads that didn't appear on any modern map. The dog's injuries had healed remarkably during their journey. His natural resilience aided by Eli's field medicine and the steady diet of stream trout and small game they had managed to catch. But it wasn't just Scout who had changed during their mountain crossing. Eli felt muscles remember their strength, instincts sharpen to their old edge, and a sense of purpose return that he hadn't experienced in decades. The evidence in his pack represented more than just proof of conspiracy. It was a chance to finally make amends for 30 years of running from the truth. The town's main street consisted of a general store, a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, and a gas station with pumps old enough to remember when fuel cost less than $1 per gallon. But it was the library that interested Eli most, a small building that promised internet access and the ability to transmit Kellerman's evidence to the contacts programmed into the satellite phone. Scout seemed less comfortable. As they approached the edge of town, his ears constantly swiveling and his posture alert. The dog had been bred and trained for wilderness survival, not urban navigation, and the presence of vehicles and buildings clearly put him on edge. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, adjusting his pack to better conceal the rifle beneath his jacket. "We'll be in and out, quick and quiet." But as they walked down the main street, Eli noticed details that triggered his professional paranoia. Too many vehicles for a town this size, especially vehicles with government plates barely concealed under civilian covers. Men who sat too still in parked cars, their eyes tracking movement with the mechanical precision of trained surveillance webs. People had found them. The realization came with cold certainty, as Eli spotted a man in the diner whose face was familiar from intelligence briefings decades old. Carl Hoskins, supposedly killed in a helicopter crash in Somalia, now sitting calmly at a corner table with a clear view of the street. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Hoskins's hand moved casually toward his jacket in a gesture that Eli recognized all too well. "Change of plans," Eli said quietly, turning away from the library and toward the general store. Scout seemed to sense the shift in tension, his body coiling with readiness despite his recent injuries. Inside the store, Eli made his way to the camping section while scanning for additional threats. The proprietor, a woman in her 60s with the weathered look of someone who had lived through economic hardship and personal loss, watched him with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read strangers quickly. "Help you find something?" she asked, her voice carrying the neutral politeness of mountain folk who preferred to mind their own business. "Satellite phone batteries," Eli replied, pulling the device from his pack. "And maybe directions to somewhere with better cell coverage." The woman glanced at the phone, then at Scout, who had positioned himself near the store's rear exit with tactical awareness that seemed almost human. "That's military issue," she observed. "You active duty?" "Retired," Eli said, meeting her gaze directly. "Long time ago." Something in his tone or bearing seemed to satisfy her. She nodded toward the back of the store, where a door marked private led to what appeared to be a storage area. "Internet's more reliable in back. Phone line too, if you need to make calls the old-fashioned way." Eli understood immediately. This woman had dealt with men like him before, people who needed communication options that didn't appear on any official records. In a town like Timber Falls, such services were probably more common than most outsiders would expect. "Much obliged," he said, following her toward the back room. Scout padded silently behind them, his attention split between the rear exit and the store's front windows. The storage area contained more than just camping supplies. A sophisticated radio setup occupied one corner, while a computer terminal connected to a satellite internet system provided communication capabilities that rivaled anything Eli had seen in his military service. This wasn't just a general store, it was a communication hub for people who needed to stay off the grid. "Name's Martha Hendricks," the woman said, settling into a chair beside the radio. "Tom Kellerman set this up for me about 5 years ago. Said there might come a day when someone would need to get a message out, someone the government types would rather keep quiet." Eli felt the pieces clicking into place. Kellerman's plan had been even more comprehensive than he had realized. The old sergeant had spent years establishing safe houses, communication points, and allies throughout the region. People like Martha, who understood that sometimes the government's interests and the people's interests weren't the same thing. "Tom's dead," Eli said simply. "But he left instructions." Martha nodded, her expression suggesting that Kellerman's death wasn't entirely unexpected. He was getting tired. Said the work was taking more out of him than he had left to give. She gestured toward the computer terminal. "Whatever you need to send, it'll go out through channels that don't officially exist. Anonymous, encrypted, untraceable." Eli began transferring Kellerman's files to the terminal, prioritizing the most damaging evidence first. Financial records showing payments to congressional staff members. Operational reports detailing assassinations carried out under the cover of training accidents. And the complete documentation of the Afghanistan mission that had started it all. As the files uploaded, Martha monitored radio frequencies with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years. "You've got company," she said quietly. 3 vehicles setting up a perimeter around the town. "Professional job. They're not planning to let anyone leave." Scout whined softly from his position near the rear exit, confirming Martha's assessment. The dog's training included threat detection, and his body language suggested immediate danger approaching from multiple directions. "How long for the upload?" Eli asked, watching the progress bar crawl across the computer screen. "Maybe 10 minutes, Martha replied. "But they'll be in position long before then." Eli studied the map Martha had taped to the wall, noting escape routes and defensive positions with the automatic assessment of a man trained for such situations. The town's layout offered limited options, but Kellerman had chosen Martha's location well. The building backed up to a creek that provided both concealment and a route toward higher ground. "There's another way," Martha said, following his gaze. "Tom showed me, in case something like this happened. Tunnel under the creek comes up in the old mine workings about a mile north. Built during Prohibition for moving liquor, never been mapped by the government." The upload reached 60% completion as Scout's ears pricked toward the front of the building. Vehicle doors slammed in the distance, followed by the sound of boots on gravel. Webb's people were moving into position, and time was running out. But as Eli prepared for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation, Martha surprised him by pulling a lever hidden beneath her radio console. A section of the floor swung open, revealing a tunnel entrance that disappeared into darkness beneath the building. "Tom said if this day came, I should tell you something," Martha said as Eli gathered his gear. "The real evidence isn't in those files. It's in Afghanistan, buried where the ambush happened. Everything else is just documentation. But the proof that'll bring them all down, that's still waiting in the mountains where it all began." The upload completed, just as the store's front door rattled under heavy pounding. Eli looked at Martha, this woman who was risking everything to help a stranger expose a truth that most people would prefer to ignore. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank Tom when you finish his work," she replied, gesturing toward the tunnel entrance. "Now go! And take care of that dog. He's been waiting 30 years for someone to complete this mission." The tunnel system beneath Timber Falls was a testament to the ingenuity of men who had lived outside the law by necessity rather than choice. And carved passages followed the natural contours of underground water flow, emerging into abandoned mine shafts that connected to a network of caves extending deep into the mountain. Scout moved through the darkness with confidence that suggested Kellerman had brought him here before. Training the dog for exactly this kind of escape, they emerged from the tunnel system 3 miles north of town, where the old mining road intersected with a Forest Service trail that few people remembered and fewer still used. Behind them, the lights of Timber Falls flickered through the trees like dying stars, while ahead stretched wilderness that offered both concealment and challenge in equal measure. But Eli's mind wasn't on immediate tactics or escape routes. Martha's revelation about Afghanistan had opened a door in his memory that he had kept locked for 30 years. The ambush site, the place where half his unit had died and the survivors had supposedly been killed, he knew those coordinates better than his own name. They were burned into his consciousness like a brand, marking the moment when his faith in everything he had believed was shattered. Scout led them to another of Kellerman's caches, this one hidden in a granite outcropping that provided both shelter and a commanding view of the approaches. Inside the cache, along with the usual survival supplies, was something that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. A manila envelope, addressed in Kellerman's careful handwriting. For Eli Thatcher, when he's ready for the whole truth. Inside the envelope were photographs. Not the official military photos from their service records, but personal snapshots taken during downtime between missions. Eli recognized the faces immediately. His unit, the men who had died in the ambush, captured in moments of laughter and camaraderie that seemed to belong to another lifetime. But there were other photographs too, ones that didn't belong in any collection of military memories. Pictures of the same men years later in civilian clothes, meeting with individuals that Eli recognized from intelligence briefings. Arms dealers, mercenary recruiters, corporate executives from defense contractors with questionable reputations. They didn't die in the ambush, Eli whispered, studying the photographs with growing understanding. None of them died. It was all staged. The implications crashed over him like an avalanche. The grief he had carried, the guilt that had driven him into exile, the nightmares that still woke him in the dark hours before dawn, all of it built on a lie that went deeper than he had imagined. Not just Webb, but his entire unit had been part of the deception. Scout whined softly and pressed against Eli's leg, as if sensing the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm him. The dog's presence was grounding, a reminder that whatever lies had been told in the past. The mission in the present was real and urgent. A handwritten note accompanied the photographs. Kellerman's final explanation of the truth he had spent decades uncovering. They recruited the whole unit, Eli. Everyone except you. Webb knew you wouldn't go along with it, knew your conscience wouldn't allow you to fake your own death and abandon your oath. So they left you behind, let you think you were the only survivor, let the guilt eat at you while they built their shadow empire. Eli's hand shook as he read the rest of Kellerman's note. The Afghanistan operation hadn't been a legitimate military mission at all. It had been a recruitment exercise, designed to extract valuable personnel from official oversight in place, them in a network where their skills could be used without the constraints of law or morality. The real evidence is buried at the ambush site, the note continued. Communications equipment, financial records, proof of the deception that started it all. Webb couldn't risk leaving it in official channels, so he had it buried with the supposed victims. It's still there, waiting for someone with the access codes to retrieve it. Access codes that only Eli would know, derived from personal information that predated the operation. Details about his family, his childhood, his reasons for joining the military. Information that Webb would have used to ensure that only the right person could access the buried evidence. The satellite phone in Eli's pack buzzed with an incoming message. The first communication he had received since leaving Martha's store. The text was brief and unsigned. Afghanistan departure 600 hours. Private airfield, grid reference attached. Come alone or don't come at all. Scout's ears pricked at the sound of the phone, and the dog moved to the cache entrance, his body language suggesting that their pursuers were closer than Eli had realized. Through the trees below, flashlight beams swept back and forth in search patterns that spoke of professional training and unlimited resources. They're herding us again, Eli said, studying the grid reference on the phone. The coordinates marked a location 50 miles south, where the mountains gave way to high desert and the kind of terrain where aircraft could land without official oversight. But this time I think we're supposed to be herded. The airfield was another piece of Kellerman's network, Eli realized. A place where questions weren't asked and manifests weren't filed with agencies that tracked such things. Someone was offering him passage to Afghanistan, to the place where the truth had been buried for 30 years. But accepting the offer meant trusting people he couldn't identify, flying into a war zone where his presence would be illegal, and confronting men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill, to protect their secrets. It was exactly the kind of operation that common sense said to avoid. Scout looked up at him expectantly, the dog's intelligent eyes reflecting the moonlight that filtered through the pine canopy. In those eyes, Eli saw the same question that had haunted him since finding the crash site. What price was he willing to pay for the truth? "Tom knew, didn't he?" Eli said to Scout, though he was really talking to himself. "He knew I'd have to go back there. Knew I couldn't let it rest once I understood what really happened." The dog's tail wagged once, a gesture that seemed to confirm Eli's assessment. Kellerman had understood him better than he understood himself, had known that a man who had spent 30 years running from the truth would eventually find the courage to confront it, no matter the cost. As they prepared to move toward the airfield coordinates, Eli made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He activated the satellite phone's emergency beacon, broadcasting their location to whatever agencies monitored such signals. If Webb's people wanted to track him, let them. If the government wanted to know what he was doing, they could follow along. The time for hiding was over. Whatever waited in Afghanistan, whatever truth had been buried with the supposed victims of that long-ago ambush, Eli intended to find it. And when he did, he would make sure the whole world knew what had been done in the name of national security and personal profit. Scout rose and padded toward the trail, looking back once to ensure that Eli was following. The dog had completed his primary mission, bringing Eli to the truth about Kellerman's evidence. Now began the final phase, the journey that would either vindicate 30 years of guilt or confirm that some truths were better left buried. Behind them, the searchlights continued their methodical sweep of the forest. But Eli no longer cared about immediate pursuit. Whatever forces Webb commanded, whatever resources he could bring to bear, the real confrontation wouldn't happen in these mountains. It would happen in the place where it all began, in the shadow of the Hindu Kush, where the dead had supposedly been buried, but the truth remained alive. The airfield existed in the grey space between legal and illegal, a strip of asphalt carved into the high desert where aircraft could land without the scrutiny of federal aviation authorities. Eli and Scout approached the coordinates as dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson, their 3-day journey through wilderness having ended at a place that seemed to exist outside normal geography. A single aircraft waited on the tarmac, a cargo plane modified for civilian use, but retaining the utilitarian design of military transport. No registration numbers were visible on its fuselage, and the crew that emerged to greet them wore the neutral clothing of contractors who asked no questions and remembered no faces. But it was the figure standing beside the aircraft that stopped Eli cold, making him question everything he thought he understood about Kellerman's plan and his own journey to this moment. Sarah. Jen stepped into the morning light with the confidence of someone accustomed to operating in the shadows. At 58, she retained the bearing of the intelligence officer she had once been, her silver hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. She wore civilian clothes, but Eli recognized the subtle signs of someone carrying concealed weapons and maintaining constant situational awareness. "Hello, Eli," she said, her voice carrying the weight of shared history and complicated loyalties. "It's been a long time, 32 years to be precise." Eli had last seen Sarah Chen in a briefing room at Bagram Air Base, where she'd been the CIA liaison coordinating intelligence for the operation that had supposedly killed his unit. The operation that had been his last official mission before requesting transfer to a rear echelon assignment and eventually leaving the service altogether. "Sarah," he said carefully, his hand moving instinctively toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. "I thought you were dead." "Officially I am," she replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Car accident in Langley, 1995. Very tragic. Very convenient." Scout moved to position himself between Eli and Sarah, the dog's training asserting itself despite the apparent lack of immediate threat. But his hackles weren't raised, suggesting that whatever danger Sarah represented, it wasn't the kind that called for physical violence. "Tom Kellerman sent you the coordinates," Sarah continued, gesturing toward the aircraft. "But I'm the one who's been coordinating this operation from the beginning." Tom was good at gathering evidence, but he lacked the resources for something this ambitious. The implications hit Eli like a physical blow. If Sarah had been coordinating with Kellerman, if she had been part of the network that brought him here, then everything he thought he understood about the conspiracy was incomplete. Sarah Chen had been one of the most respected intelligence officers of her generation, known for her integrity and her unwillingness to compromise her principles for political expedience. "You're working with Webb," Eli said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'm working against Webb," Sarah corrected, her expression hardening. "Have been for 15 years, ever since I discovered what really happened in Afghanistan and realized how many good people had been manipulated into serving his agenda." She pulled a tablet from her jacket and activated a video file that showed Webb in what appeared to be a recent recording. But the man on the screen wasn't the charismatic leader Eli remembered from their military service. This Webb looked older, harder, with the kind of paranoid edge that came from years of looking over his shoulder. "Marcus has been hunting me since I faked my death," Sarah explained. "He knows I have evidence that could bring down his entire organization, but he also knows I can't use it without exposing sources and methods that would compromise other operations. It's been a stalemate for over a decade." The video showed Webb in conversation with men Eli didn't recognize, but their body language and the deference they showed suggested high-level government officials. The audio was clear enough to catch fragments of conversation about asset management and operational security, terms that in this context sounded more like organized crime than national defense. "The evidence in Afghanistan isn't just proof of what Webb did 30 years ago," Sarah continued. "It's the key to a network that's been operating ever since, selling classified intelligence to the highest bidder and manipulating conflicts for profit." Tom understood that exposing the original conspiracy was just the beginning. Scout whined softly, his attention focused on something beyond the immediate conversation. In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of vehicles moving across the desert at high speed. Their time for explanations was running out. "Why now?" Eli asked as they moved toward the aircraft. "Why bring me into this after 30 years? "Because Marcus is dying," Sarah said simply. "Pancreatic cancer, maybe 6 months left. He's trying to tie up loose ends, eliminate anyone who could threaten his organization after he's gone." Tom was on that list. "You're on that list. I'm at the top of that list." The approaching vehicles were close enough now for Eli to count them. 6 black SUVs moving in formation across the desert floor. Their occupants undoubtedly armed and operating under orders to prevent any aircraft from leaving the airfield. "The cargo bay," Sarah said, leading them up the aircraft's rear ramp. "We'll be in the air before they can establish a perimeter." But as they entered the aircraft, Eli saw something that made him question whether escape was Sarah's primary objective. The cargo bay was fitted with sophisticated communications equipment, weapons racks containing military-grade firearms, and computers displaying real-time intelligence feeds from around the world. This wasn't just transportation to Afghanistan. It was a mobile command center, equipped for a mission that went far beyond retrieving buried evidence. "What aren't you telling me?" Eli asked, as the engines spooled up and the aircraft began moving toward the runway. Sarah's expression became grim as she activated one of the computer displays. "The evidence in Afghanistan isn't just documentation, Eli. It's leverage. Financial records, operational codes, and most importantly, the real identities of government officials who've been compromised by Webb's organization." The display showed a list of names that made Eli's blood run cold. Senators, federal judges, cabinet-level officials, and foreign intelligence chiefs, all connected to Webb's network through financial transactions or operational cooperation. If that information becomes public without proper context, It could destabilize governments and compromise ongoing operations that have nothing to do with Webb's corruption, Sarah continued. But if it falls into the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon that could be used to manipulate policy for decades. The aircraft lifted off just as the pursuing vehicles reached the airfield perimeter, their occupants emerging to establish firing positions that were already too late to be effective. But Eli's attention was focused on the implications of what Sarah had revealed. "You're not just after justice," he realized. "You're after control. You want to replace Webb's network with your own." Sarah's silence was answer enough. The woman he had known 30 years ago, the intelligence officer with an unshakable moral compass, had been changed by decades of operating in the shadows. She might genuinely want to stop Webb, but her methods and motivations had become as questionable as those of the man she opposed. Scout pressed against Eli's leg, the dog's presence a reminder that whatever Sarah's agenda, the truth still mattered. Kellerman had died trying to expose corruption, not transfer it to different hands. The evidence in Afghanistan belonged to the American people, not to any individual or organization that claimed to know how to use it responsibly. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, Eli realized that the conspiracy was even larger than he had imagined. It wasn't just about Webb's organization or even the network of officials they had compromised. It was about the entire system of shadow governance that operated beyond public oversight, accountable to no one and justified by the claim that some truths were too dangerous for democracy to handle. The journey to Afghanistan would give him time to plan, time to decide whether Sarah Chen was a potential ally or just another manipulator in an elaborate game where the stakes were measured in lives and the rules were written by those with the power to break them. But one thing had become clear during their conversation at the airfield. When they reached the burial site where his unit had supposedly died, Eli would be the only person present whose loyalty wasn't compromised by decades of moral ambiguity. In the end, that might be the only advantage he needed. The flight to Afghanistan stretched across 14 hours of uneasy silence, broken only by the steady drone of engines and the occasional whine from Scout, who had never been comfortable with air travel. Eli spent most of the journey studying satellite imagery of the ambush site, memorizing details that had changed in 30 years while trying to reconcile his memories with the reality that everything he had believed about that day was a carefully constructed lie. Sarah worked at her computer stations with the focused intensity of someone coordinating multiple operations simultaneously. Phone calls in languages Eli didn't recognize, encrypted messages that appeared and disappeared from her screens, and constant monitoring of intelligence feeds that tracked movements across Central Asia. Whatever network she commanded, it was extensive and well-funded. "The burial site is here," Sarah said during one of their few conversations, pointing to a location on the digital map that made Eli's chest tighten with recognition. Grid coordinates 34.2847 north, 69,1748 east, the same location where you were told your unit died in the ambush. The coordinates were burned into Eli's memory, marked forever as the place where his faith in everything he had believed was shattered. He had never returned to Afghanistan after that mission, had never wanted to see the place where good soldiers had supposedly died because of his failure to anticipate Taliban tactics. Now he understood that there had been no tactical failure, no unexpected enemy contact, no tragic miscalculation. There had only been theater, a carefully staged performance designed to provide cover for the disappearance of men who had chosen profit over patriotism. "The access codes," Sarah continued, consulting data that could only have come from sources deep within the intelligence community. Webb used personal information from your service record, your mother's maiden name, the street where you grew up, your father's military service number. He assumed that if anyone ever came looking for the evidence, it would be someone who knew you well enough to have access to that information. It was a logical assumption. Eli reflected. In 1992, The idea that a single soldier would spend 30 years investigating the circumstances of his unit's supposed death would have seemed paranoid rather than prescient. Webb had planned for official investigation, for intelligence oversight, for congressional inquiry. He hadn't planned for the patient, methodical work of a man like Thomas Kellerman. As they approached Afghan airspace, Sarah's communication activity intensified. Clearance codes were transmitted to ground controllers. Flight plans were filed with authorities who asked no questions about passenger manifests. And arrangements were made for ground transportation that would operate outside official oversight. Local warlord named Razak controls the territory where we're going, Sarah explained as they began their descent toward a private airfield north of Kabul. His family has been smuggling goods across these mountains for generations. As long as we pay his fees and don't interfere with his operations, he'll provide security and transportation. The Afghanistan that Eli saw through the aircraft windows bore little resemblance to the country he remembered from his military service. 3 decades of continuous conflict had changed the landscape, but the mountains remained eternal, their snow-capped peaks rising toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue after the grey winters of Montana. Scout pressed against Eli's leg as the aircraft touched down on a runway that was barely more than compressed earth marked with stones. The dog's training had prepared him for many environments, but the heat and dust of Central Asia were clearly outside his comfort zone. The airfield existed in the kind of legal grey area that characterized much of Afghanistan's economy. Official enough to handle international flights, unofficial enough to avoid the scrutiny of governments that preferred not to know about certain types of cargo. Razak's men provided security with a mixture of modern weapons and traditional tribal authority that had proven more durable than any government Afghanistan had produced. Razak himself was a man in his 50s who carried the bearing of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions without consulting external authority. His English was accented but precise, suggesting education that went far beyond what most outsiders would expect from a mountain warlord. Sight you seek is dangerous territory, he informed them as they transferred to vehicles that looked like they had been assembled from parts of several different trucks. Taliban controls the passes during winter months. Government forces patrol the valleys during summer. But the spring melt has created a window, maybe 2 weeks before the roads become impassable again. The journey to the burial site would take them through terrain that had been contested by various forces for centuries. Alexander the Great had marched through these valleys. British armies had died in these passes. Soviet forces had learned the futility of conquering mountains that had no strategic value beyond their ability to hide enemies. As they loaded supplies into the vehicles, Eli noticed that Sarah's equipment included more than just excavation tools. Military-grade communications gear, weapons that suggested expectations of serious resistance, and medical supplies that indicated preparation for casualties. Whatever she expected to find at the burial site, she was planning for opposition. "Marcus knows we're here," she said, adjusting the frequency on a handheld radio. "His people have been monitoring my activities for years. They'll move to intercept us, probably somewhere in the mountain passes where they can control the engagement parameters." Scout seemed to sense the growing tension, his ears constantly swiveling to track sounds that human ears couldn't detect. The dog had been trained for mountain warfare, but 30 years of peaceful retirement in Montana hadn't erased his instincts. If anything, the return to a combat environment seemed to be awakening capabilities that had been dormant for decades. The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles, carrying a total of 8 men, plus Eli, Sarah, and Scout. Razak's fighters were experienced mountain warfare specialists who had survived decades of conflict by understanding terrain, weather, and human nature in equal measure. They treated the mission with the professional respect accorded to any operation that paid well and carried significant risk. As they climbed into the mountains, following roads that were barely more than goat trails carved into cliff faces. Eli found himself remembering details from his original mission that had seemed insignificant at the time. The way Webb had insisted on specific routes, the communications equipment that had malfunctioned at crucial moments, the Taliban forces that had appeared with suspicious timing and coordination. "You're starting to remember," Sarah observed, watching his expression as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of mountain road. "Tom said you would, once you were back in the environment where it happened." The human mind has ways of protecting itself from traumatic memories, but it also has ways of recovering them when they're needed. The memories were indeed returning, not as the confused fragments that had haunted his nightmares, but as clear, detailed recollections of events that had been deliberately obscured by emotional trauma. He remembered Webb's radio calls that seemed to provide Taliban forces with American positions, equipment failures that forced his unit into predetermined kill zones, and evacuation procedures that left him behind while supposedly dead soldiers were extracted by helicopters that arrived with suspicious promptness. "They knew I wouldn't go along with it," Eli said, the understanding bringing both clarity and renewed anger. "So they set me up to be the sole survivor, the witness who would validate their deaths and provide credibility for their disappearance." Marcus always was thorough, Sarah agreed. He understood that the best lies contain elements of truth, and that the most effective deception comes from allowing the target to deceive themselves. "You spent 30 years blaming yourself for their deaths because that was easier than accepting that everything you believed about duty and honor was a lie." As evening approached, they reached a staging area about 5 miles from the burial site, an abandoned forward operating base that had been used by various military forces over the years and now served as a waypoint for anyone traveling through this remote section of the mountains. The compound provided defensible positions and clear fields of fire, essential considerations given Sarah's warning about probable interception. While Razak's men established security and prepared equipment for the final approach to the burial site, Eli found himself alone with Scout for the first time since leaving the airfield. The dog seemed to understand the significance of their location, his behavior suggesting heightened alertness, combined with an almost human awareness of the emotional weight that this place carried. "Tomorrow we find out the truth," Eli said, scratching behind Scout's ears while watching the sun set behind mountain peaks that had witnessed centuries of human conflict. "Question is, what are we going to do with it once we have it?" Scout's response was a low whine that somehow conveyed both loyalty and concern. The dog had spent 30 years waiting for this moment, trained by Kellerman to guide the right person to the right place at the right time. But even the most carefully planned operation carried risks that no amount of preparation could eliminate. As darkness settled over the mountains, Eli realized that the approaching confrontation would determine more than just the fate of Webb's conspiracy. It would decide whether the truth about government corruption would be used to serve justice or simply to transfer power from one shadow network to another. In the end, the choice might come down to a single decision made by a man and his dog in the mountains where it all began, where the dead were supposed to rest, but the truth remained very much. A live dawn came to the Hindu Kush with the kind of crystalline clarity that made every peak stand out against the sky like a photograph etched in silver and gold. Eli had barely slept, his mind churning through memories that 30 years of guilt had distorted beyond recognition. Now, with the burial site less than 2 hours away, those memories were arranging themselves into a pattern that revealed the true scope of Webb's deception. Scout sensed the approaching climax, his behavior shifting from the patient alertness of a trained companion to the focused intensity of a working dog preparing for action. The animal moved through the abandoned compound with purpose, checking perimeters and escape routes with the thoroughness of someone who understood that survival often depended on preparation rather than reaction. Sarah emerged from the communications shelter with news that confirmed Eli's growing suspicions about the day ahead. "Webb's people are already at the site," she reported, consulting intelligence updates that had been flowing in throughout the night. Satellite imagery shows at least 12 operatives in defensive positions around the burial location. They're not planning to negotiate. Razak studied the tactical situation with the calm assessment of a man who had survived decades of mountain warfare by understanding when to fight and when to withdraw. "They have chosen their ground well," he observed, pointing to features on the topographic map that showed the burial site's natural advantages. High ground, clear fields of fire, multiple escape routes. This will not be easy, but it was the equipment readings that troubled Eli most. Sarah's communications gear was detecting electronic signatures that suggested Webb's people had brought more than just small arms to the confrontation. Ground-penetrating radar, excavation equipment, and what appeared to be explosive ordnance disposal gear, all indicating that they were prepared to destroy the evidence rather than allow it to fall into the wrong hands. They're going to blow the site. Eli realized, studying the electronic intercepts, that painted a picture of desperate men making final preparations. Whatever's buried there, they'd rather see it destroyed than exposed. The implications hit home with cold clarity. Webb's organization had survived for 30 years by controlling information, by ensuring that secrets remained buried and witnesses remained silent. Faced with the possibility of complete exposure, they would choose destruction over discovery, even if it meant eliminating the leverage that had protected them for decades. As the convoy prepared for the final approach to the burial site, Eli found himself checking and rechecking equipment with the methodical precision of a soldier, preparing for combat. His grandfather's Winchester, cleaned and loaded with the care of someone who understood that accuracy might mean the difference between truth and silence. The portable drives containing Kellerman's evidence, sealed in waterproof containers and distributed among multiple packs to ensure survival even if some were lost. Scout took his place beside Eli in the lead vehicle, the dog's presence somehow more comforting than all the tactical planning and professional preparation. This animal had been trained for exactly this mission, had spent years learning the skills and developing the instincts that would be needed to navigate the dangers. Ahead, the mountain road to the burial site followed the same route that Eli's unit had taken 30 years ago, winding through passes that seemed designed to channel travelers into predetermined locations. As they climbed higher, details of the original mission continued to surface in his memory. Communications protocols that had been unnecessarily complex, supply drops that had contained equipment they hadn't requested, and timing that had forced them into positions that seemed tactically questionable even at the time. "The access point is just ahead," Sarah announced, consulting GPS coordinates that matched Eli's increasingly clear recollections. "Grid reference 34-2847 north, 69,017-48 east. The same location where your unit was supposedly overrun by Taliban forces. Through the vehicle's windshield, Eli could see the ridgeline where the ambush had occurred, the rocky outcropping where he had taken cover while his unit was supposedly destroyed around him. But now he understood that the Taliban forces had been coordinated with American personnel, that the entire engagement had been choreographed to provide cover for an extraction operation that officially never happened. As they approached the final kilometer to the burial site, Scout suddenly stiffened, his ears pricked toward sounds that human hearing couldn't detect. The dog's training included threat assessment, and his body language suggested immediate danger from multiple directions. Razak's radio crackled with reports from scouts who had been monitoring the approaches to the site. "Movement on the eastern ridge," came the whispered transmission. "At least 6 positions, professional spacing, coordinated fields of fire." The trap was closing with mechanical precision, but this time Eli understood the parameters. Webb's people weren't just trying to prevent access to the buried evidence. They were trying to eliminate everyone who knew about it. Sarah, Eli, even Razak's fighters who had provided transportation. All of them represented security risks that couldn't be allowed to survive. But as they reached the final approach to the burial site, Eli realized that Webb had made one crucial miscalculation. He had planned for resistance from intelligence professionals, for opposition from military contractors, for interference from government oversight. He hadn't planned for the determination of a man who had spent 30 years carrying guilt that belonged to someone else. Guided by a dog whose loyalty transcended the moral ambiguity that had corrupted everyone else involved. The confrontation that was about to unfold would determine more than just the fate of buried evidence. It would decide whether truth or power would prevail in a conflict that had been building for 3 decades. The burial site lay in a natural depression surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided both concealment and tactical advantage to whoever controlled the high ground. Webb's people had chosen their positions well, establishing overlapping fields of fire that covered all approaches while maintaining escape routes toward the northern passes. But as Eli studied the terrain through binoculars, he began to see patterns that Webb's planners had missed. The site wasn't just a grave, it was a communications hub, carefully positioned to provide line-of-sight contact with relay stations throughout the region. Kellerman had been right about more than just the evidence. This location had been chosen for its strategic value, not just its isolation. Scout moved through the rocks with the fluid grace of an animal that had been born for this environment, his training evident in every step as he navigated terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain fighters. The dog's reconnaissance revealed details that human observation had missed: recent excavation around the burial markers, electronic equipment positioned to detect approaching threats, and most importantly, the locations of pressure-sensitive devices that suggested the entire site had been rigged for destruction. Demolition charges, Eli whispered into his radio, confirming what Sarah's electronic surveillance had suggested. They're planning to bring down the entire ridge if they can't maintain control of the site. The implications were staggering. Webb's organization was prepared to destroy evidence that could expose decades of corruption, even if it meant eliminating their own people in the process. The men positioned around the burial site weren't just defending a location. They were manning a position they might not be expected to survive. Through the scope of his grandfather's Winchester, Eli could see individual faces among Webb's defensive positions. Some he recognized from intelligence files, former military personnel who had been recruited into the shadow network over the years. Others were younger, probably contractors hired for their skills, rather than their knowledge of the operation's history, but it was the figure moving between positions with obvious command authority that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. Even at this distance, even after 30 years, Marcus Webb's bearing was unmistakable. The man who had supposedly died in Afghanistan was very much alive, coordinating the defense of secrets that had cost lives and corrupted governments. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio with tactical updates that painted an increasingly dangerous picture. Perimeter security has been expanded. They're not just defending the burial site, they're prepared for a siege. Someone's told them we have more resources than we actually do. The miscalculation worked in their favor, Eli realized. Webb's people had prepared for opposition from government forces or rival intelligence organizations. They hadn't prepared for the targeted precision of a small team led by someone who knew the terrain from personal experience and guided by an animal whose training had been specifically designed for this mission. As the morning sun climbed higher, creating shadows that would provide concealment for the final approach, Eli made the decision that had been building since he first found Scout in his Montana camp. This wasn't about Sarah's agenda or Razak's profit or even Kellerman's posthumous revenge. This was about 30 years of guilt that belonged to someone else. About good soldiers whose deaths had been faked to serve corrupt purposes. About truth that had been buried in these mountains and needed to see daylight. "I'm going in alone," he announced. checking his equipment with the methodical precision of someone who understood that small details often determined large outcomes. Scout and I can reach the burial site without triggering their perimeter defenses. Once we have the evidence, we'll signal for extraction. Sarah's protest was immediate and professional. The odds are impossible. Even if you reach the site, Webb's people will never let you leave with the evidence. This needs to be a coordinated assault with proper support. But Eli had already made his choice, guided by instincts that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous situations. Large operations created large signatures that could be detected and countered. Small operations, properly executed, could succeed where overwhelming force would fail. Scout seemed to understand the plan without explanation, the dog's body language shifting to match Eli's tactical mindset. Together, they had advantages that no amount of planning could replicate: intimate knowledge of the terrain, emotional investment in the outcome, and most importantly, the element of surprise that came from approaching the problem from an entirely unexpected direction. As they prepared for the final approach to the burial site, Eli realized that everything in his life had been leading to this moment. The military service that had taught him tactical skills, the wilderness exile that had honed his survival instincts, the guilt that had driven him to seek truth. Regardless of personal cost, all of it had been preparation for a mission that he was finally ready to complete. The sun reached its zenith as Eli and Scout began their approach to the place where the truth had been buried for 30 years. Behind them, Sarah coordinated backup plans, and Razak positioned his fighters for contingencies that might never be needed. Ahead lay the final confrontation between a man seeking redemption and the ghosts of betrayal that had haunted him for 3 decades. The confrontation with Webb lasted less than 10 minutes, but those minutes contained 30 years of accumulated truth that could no longer be buried beneath lies and classified documents. When Eli emerged from the burial site with a metal case that contained evidence of government corruption spanning 3 decades, Webb's organization faced a choice between destruction and exposure that they had spent years avoiding: the demolition. Charges that were supposed to eliminate the evidence instead became the instrument of Webb's downfall. Scout's training in explosive detection had allowed them to locate and disable the primary charges while leaving the secondary devices active, a tactical decision that forced Webb's people to choose between immediate destruction and strategic withdrawal. Webb himself made the choice that defined his character and sealed his fate. Rather than face exposure and accountability, he triggered the remaining charges manually, bringing down a section of the ridge that eliminated both the burial site and several of his own operatives. The man who had spent 30 years manipulating others from the shadows chose self-destruction over the possibility of justice. But the evidence had already been extracted. Gellerman's cache, hidden beneath what appeared to be a simple grave marker, contained more than just documentation of the original conspiracy. Financial records, communication logs, and operational reports that detailed 3 decades of illegal activities conducted under the cover of national security, all of it authenticated by access codes that only someone with Eli's personal history could have provided. The satellite phone that had brought them to Afghanistan now carried that evidence back to the world, transmitted through channels that Sarah's network had established but could no longer control. Congressional oversight committees, international tribunals, and investigative journalists received simultaneous copies of documentation that would take years to fully analyze, but could not be suppressed or dismissed. Sarah's reaction to the evidence transmission revealed the final layer of moral complexity that had driven the entire conspiracy. She had genuinely wanted to stop Webb's organization, but she had also wanted to control how the truth was revealed and used. The complete exposure that Eli chose eliminated her ability to manage the aftermath, forcing her to choose between supporting justice and protecting her own network. In the end, she chose justice, providing testimony that corroborated the documentary evidence and helped investigators understand the full scope of operations that had been conducted outside legal oversight. Her cooperation came with a price: immunity from prosecution, in exchange for information that led to arrests throughout the intelligence community, but it represented a return to the principles that had originally motivated her career. The journey back to Montana took 3 weeks, long enough for the first wave of arrests to begin and for the media coverage to establish the basic facts of what would become known as the Blackwater Scandal. Eli and Scout traveled together, two survivors of a mission that had finally reached completion after 30 years of patient preparation. The cabin in the Montana wilderness looked exactly as they had left it. But Eli's relationship with solitude had been fundamentally changed by their journey. The guilt that had driven him into exile was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose that made isolation seem like a luxury he could no longer afford. Scout seemed to understand that their mission was complete, but their partnership would continue. The dog had been trained for a specific purpose, but his intelligence and loyalty made him an ideal companion for whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they had proven that truth could prevail over deception, that courage could overcome corruption, and that some loyalties transcended the moral compromises that had corrupted so many others. The congressional hearings that followed generated headlines for months, revealing connections between Webb's organization and political figures that reached to the highest levels of government. Defense contractors lost contracts, intelligence officials faced criminal charges, and foreign policy decisions were re-examined in light of evidence that showed how shadow networks had manipulated events for profit. But the most significant change was harder to quantify. The revelation that supposedly dead soldiers had been used to create a private army, accountable to no government, sparked reforms in how military personnel were tracked and how classified operations were overseen. Families who had grieved for decades learned that their loved ones might still be alive, working for organizations that had no legal right to their service. Eli testified before Congress twice, his simple account of the original mission providing context that helped investigators understand how the conspiracy had been able to operate for so long. His credibility as a witness came not from his military record, but from his 30 years of exile, the price he had paid for refusing to accept comfortable lies about duty and sacrifice. The final vindication came in a letter from one of the soldiers who had supposedly died in the Afghanistan ambush. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, officially killed in action in 1992, contacted Eli through congressional investigators to explain his regret for participating in the deception and his gratitude that someone had finally exposed the truth. "We thought we were serving a higher purpose," Rodriguez wrote. "Webb convinced us that our official deaths would free us to fight enemies that the government couldn't acknowledge. It took years to realize we had become the enemies we thought we were fighting." As autumn settled over the Montana mountains, Eli sat on his cabin porch with Scout beside him, watching the first snow of the season dust the peaks where they had first discovered Kellerman's trail. The satellite phone that had connected them to Sarah's network was silent now, its mission complete. But other forms of communication had replaced it. Letters from investigators seeking clarification on details, calls from journalists working on follow-up stories, and most importantly, messages from families who were learning that their grief had been built on deception, all of it representing the ongoing work of truth-telling that would continue long after the headlines faded. Scout's tail wagged as a vehicle approached along the mountain road, the first visitor they had received since returning from Afghanistan. But this time, Eli didn't reach for the rifle that hung by the door. The sound of the engine was familiar, and the dog's body language suggested welcome rather than warning. Martha Hendricks emerged from the truck with a smile that spoke of shared understanding and mutual respect. She had closed her store in Timber Falls and driven north to see for herself that Kellerman's final mission had been completed successfully. "Tom would be proud," she said simply, scratching behind Scout's ears while studying Eli's face for signs of the changes that such journeys inevitably produced. "You both came home, and in the gathering darkness of a Montana evening, with snow beginning to fall and a loyal dog at his side, Eli Thatcher finally understood what home really meant.